St. Thomas Aquinas High School, and I was competing for Olathe East, some Three Trails NFL classic debates lineups. We never actually got to debate each other in high school, although one time we were paired against each other for the Three Trails NFL qualifier Lincoln Douglas debate. I think you were affirmative, is that right?
I just know I was glad it didn't happen.
And so Beth was like reading the 1AC, but there was like an error in the pairings. And so Beth's coach, Steve DuBois, busted into the room and said, "Stop the debate! The debate is wrong. This debate has to be canceled." And we never actually got to debate each other in high school, but we did debate a couple times in college. So Dr. Elizabeth Mendenhall earned her PhD in international relations in 2017 from Johns Hopkins University and is now an associate professor in the Department of Marine Affairs at the University of Rhode Island with a joint appointment in political science. Her research centers on the ocean governance regime, especially the Law of the Sea Convention. Dr. Mendenhall is an expert in Arctic governance and was a 2022 Fulbright Scholar in the Polar Law Program at the University of Akureyri, Iceland.
Akureyri.
One more time.
Akureyri.
Akureyri, Iceland. Additionally, Dr. Mendenhall is a K-State debate alum and a national champion, winning the 2011 Cross-Examination Debate Association National Championship. Please provide a warm round of applause. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm always so excited when the college debate topic or high school debate topic is related to ocean governance, global commons, Arctic, outer space, because that debate led me to those topics. And that's what I got into afterwards in graduate school and now in my job. And it's definitely true that I've been where you are now, and that my participation in debate and going to K-State in particular really helped propel me through graduate school and onto the tenure track and onto tenure. So I'm really happy for you all that you're spending part of your summer doing this. This is my plan. This is one of the K-State debate teams I was a part of. I just couldn't resist throwing in a photo. My focus is really on territory and jurisdiction disputes in the Arctic because that has the strongest overlap with my foundational area of expertise in law of the sea. But I do want to say some general things about Arctic governance, about the US, kind of Alaska relationship. And then at the end, I'm far enough out of debate that I'm not up on what the cool arguments are these days. But once a debater, always a debater. So like if I were you all investigating this topic from both sides, I included some slides about what I might start researching based on what I already know. I had anticipated a sort of easy interaction between us in this next hour, which is why I suggested that you tell me about your arguments along the way or ask questions along the way. I think I'll let Dan kind of manage that. If you have burning questions that you kind of can't move on and understanding what we're talking about until you get it answered, then I'm happy to be interrupted. But I am also conscious of the time, and I'm someone who generally fills it quite easily. So I think we'll go ahead and start with some useful geophysical and a little bit of human facts about the Arctic, which can be relevant whether you're trying to solve something in the Arctic or explain why the other team can't. You should know the word cryosphere. It's a great word. It means the icy parts of the planet. There are three elements of the cryosphere: the Arctic, the Antarctic, and they say the third pole is like the Himalayas in Asia. So you obviously know that the Arctic ice cap, which floats in the water of the Arctic Ocean, is melting. Don't forget that the land itself is melting too. So permafrost melt is a big feature of what is happening in the Arctic. And this is going to mess with any kind of infrastructure currently on Arctic coastlines or which the other team may be proposing to build or use on Arctic coastlines. Obviously, climate change is the cause of the melting ice cap, but there are positive feedback loops in the Arctic that mean that warming causes more warming. And so this is definitely an issue for any kind of case that wants to solve climate change. So on the left, we have an image of thermokarst. This is when frozen parts of the ground that were previously permafrost collapse. So ice gives the ground a kind of structure that you can build on. When the land melts, it collapses, you lose that structure. And also, there's a lot of formerly frozen organic material that starts to break down. and releases greenhouse gas emissions, especially methane. So permafrost melt creates thermokarst, leads to more warming. There's also the phenomenon of albedo change. Albedo is just the reflective capacity of a surface. The lighter the surface is, the more of the sun's radiation it reflects. So when you have more open ocean and less ice cap, or you have a meltwater pool on top of a glacier or part of the ice cap, that's going to absorb more of the sun's energy, cause more melting. So really challenging for any team to say that they are solving climate change by any kind of intervention in the Arctic. I guess shouldn't speak too strongly in front of a group of debaters, but there are geoengineering proposals, for example, to cover the sea surface of the melting Arctic Ocean with more reflective things to kind of slow down this melting. But anyway, lots of positive feedback loops. Here are two big ones to know about. In terms of the ice melt, the ice is going to last the longest off the coast of Canada and Greenland. So any kind of harvesting of this ice or any impacts related to ice-dependent species are going to be different in terms of how soon they're going to come or where the resource will be available, depending upon what part of the Arctic ice you're talking about. There's 6 big rivers that flow into the Arctic, and the 4 biggest are in Russia. Their total inflow into the Arctic is 3 to 4 times the 2 big rivers in the US and Canada. So when it comes to pollution of Arctic waters, if you're not dealing with these Russian rivers, you're not solving it. Russia is suspected of having put low-level nuclear waste into those rivers to run out into the Arctic up until the 90s. Also, big plastic inflows. I do international relations, and I think a lot from the geographical and geophysical perspective. So Arctic peoples are not my area of expertise. But I did want to point out that of the 4 million residents in the Arctic, and I believe that definition is Arctic Circle, although this map shows beyond the Arctic Circle, half of those people live in Russia. Russia also has half of the Arctic coastline. So the Arctic is, in a significant way, it is Russia. In terms of indigenous communities in the Arctic, they sort of group into different language groupings, as shown by this slide. But from a political perspective, 2 interesting things are that there are many indigenous peoples' political organizations, some of which are transboundary. So the Inuit Circumpolar Council is the biggest transboundary indigenous peoples organization in this region. It's got like 130,000 members. But depending on the state you're talking about, the indigenous community may or may not have any special political status. So indigenous groups in Russia, for example, don't have the same kind of political or economical or even social rights that indigenous groups may have in Norway or in Greenland, Denmark, or Canada or the US. So a wide range of experiences in terms of how elevated or recognized or respected indigenous identity and livelihoods are. That's it for my basic facts. Of course, I teach about the Arctic, so I was drawing from many different slides, and I thought, well, these are quick facts that might help you in a cross-sex situation ask a devastating question. And that, so I kind of want you to know basically about the region. So when you're talking about the Arctic as a region, in some senses, it is an international region, meaning a small group of states kind of manage the region or have primary experiences or claims in the region. But on the other hand, the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by states, surrounded by land, and the middle parts of it are really properly understood as a global part of the region in the sense that states from around the world have access and have rights to even resources in those areas. The main thing you got to know is these law of the sea zones. And actually, this is something I learned about as a high school debater that got me into this topic for my career. So it seems really boring, but it's actually extremely cool. And on this image, which we'll come back to, what I want you to focus on now is the water parts. So there's a different set of zones and a different set of rules for the water parts of the Arctic Ocean versus the seabed. When you're talking about the water, the 2 main zones are the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, which the coastal state has special rights over. And then on the outside of that is the high seas, which is a global common zone. So here's two maps of that in the Arctic. On the left, you can just see highlighted the three parts of the Arctic that are high seas area. The big one being the CAO, the Central Arctic Ocean. But there's also this little banana hole and this loophole that are between the exclusive economic zone claims of Arctic coastal states. You might also use this word littoral as a synonym for coastal. Those are the states which border the Arctic Ocean. On the right, the different exclusive economic zone or EEZ claims of each Arctic littoral state are highlighted, and the arrows point to two maritime boundary disputes that I'll come back to later. The one in the top right is the Bering Sea, and sort of more to the bottom left is the Beaufort Sea. So we'll return to that. There are some disputes over who controls water space, but most of the story is going to be on the seafloor. Lot of text on this slide, so I'll try to talk through it slowly. And of course, I've shared this PowerPoint. You're welcome to look at it, take thorough notes later. The Arctic Council is part of Arctic governance, but you should really lower your expectations for what it can accomplish. So I call it a small multilateral organization. The A5 are the Arctic littoral states, US, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and Russia. The membership of the Arctic Council is slightly broader. It's the A8. It includes Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, they don't have really coastal space abutting the Arctic Ocean. The photo on the bottom right is me in the Icelandic Arctic that you have to take a 2-hour ferry to. And then you walk to the northern end of this island, and there's this like art that I'm pretending to kick over that tells you you've crossed the Arctic Circle. But that's like on the end of the island. There's nobody that lives in the Icelandic Arctic. There's no like infrastructure, nothing. So Sweden, Finland, and Iceland are sort of less Arctic than the A5, who like to exclude them. But for the case of the Arctic Council, it includes though that broader A8 category. The Arctic Council is a soft law organization in the sense that when it makes decisions as a group, those decisions aren't like binding rules on its members. So it's sort of a forum for international or multilateral cooperation. And they've only come up in their time since 1996 with 3 binding agreements. So they become like a separate agreement, and then they can commit to that agreement. But that binding even there doesn't apply very well because it's like voluntary cooperative measures. And they're on what I would call low politics issues, search and rescue, pollution preparedness, and scientific research. And it's basically like we're going to cooperate on these issues of mutual interest. The Arctic Council from the get-go was founded thinking about these low politics issues like environment and human well-being. It has never and it will never deal with territory or military issues. One of the reasons it's praised, though, is it does have a more special status for indigenous political organizations. These are the permanent participants. They don't have full voting rights the way states do, but they are literally at the table. Like if you Google Arctic Council meeting on a Google image search, you'll see the table and it has the states and the permanent participants. And observers like China or the EU, they're like in the back row. And the permanent participants are in practice allowed to talk just as much as the states. So that's unique for an international organization. It's not ideal depending on your perspective, but it is progressive relative to other international decision-making forums.
Dr. Mendenhall,
Yo, please go ahead.
our students just started learning about counterplans,
Mm-hmm.
and Arctic Council is a popular actor for a counterplan.
Yeah.
Might you talk about what soft law might mean for counterplans and making arguments about counterplans?
Yeah. So first of all, I think part of that debate will be what is the Arctic Council as a separate thing from its members, the member states. It is true that the Arctic Council has a secretariat in Norway. It's like the permanent kind of employees that make things work. And secretariats can be very influential in terms of setting the agenda for Arctic Council meetings. And it is true also that there's a rotating chair, that one state will be kind of in charge of the Arctic Council for a limited term. I think it's 2 years. if the Arctic Council were to do something that solves the plan, it would probably be through the format of its working groups. So this is like groups that the members can join, and that can include permanent participants and probably also observers that are like focused on certain issue areas. So maybe something like search and rescue for the emerging Arctic cruise tourism industry. And that could be a better channel for pooling resources. It could be a good channel for building norms. So like soft law means that there isn't like a clear, precise obligation that if you violate it, there's like a punishment or a cost. But soft law can still do things like building shared expectations, building kind of normative commitments, like it's a good thing to do this, it's a bad thing to do that. And it's a good vehicle for what I'll call later in the presentation science diplomacy. Basically, like scientists coming up with agreements and working together that paves the way for states, even at the military level, to do that. It's good to know you're just learning about counterplans. In the early 2000s, in the 2010s, the Arctic Council was written about a lot as exceptional. When Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, like all this West-East, like Russia, the US and allies cooperation stuff started to break down. But the Arctic Council persisted. It kept meeting, it kept talking about stuff. But since the full invasion of Ukraine in 2022, I call the Arctic Council moribund, Moribund, which means like it's still there, but it's kind of seems dead a little bit. Like it's not, I don't think they're actively meeting. There's basically a lot of protest against Russian participation. So a counter plan, though, could help us get past that and revive the Arctic Council. And I think there are strong arguments that the Arctic Council is needed, one of which relates to this Ilulissat Declaration. So this notably was only the Arctic 5 states. So the Arctic Council already existed for 12 years by this time, but the Arctic 5 still on their own, they meet in Greenland and they issue this declaration, which is like a soft or even softer version than soft law. It's just a shared commitment. And they say, listen, we already have the Law of the Sea Convention that is going to govern the Arctic Ocean. And we have the Arctic Council as like a forum to work out any issues. We don't need an Arctic regional organization. We don't need some kind of higher level international thing that's going to tell us all what to do. So the Arctic 5 states, they have committed to the Arctic Council. It's not going to become more than it already is. We will just use the law of the sea to resolve any of our cooperation issues. Of course, that could change. But this is one reason why we haven't developed a more like hard law decision-making organization that has particular rules and rights just for the Arctic. As we'll see, the parts of the ocean in the Arctic that are in the middle, that are commons where multiple states can share and use them, those are organized and managed just the same way that the middle of the ocean and the Pacific or the Atlantic, the high seas anywhere, how those are managed. It's not special for the Arctic. So when you're managing the high seas out beyond the exclusive economic zone, the starting point is freedom of the seas. Every state can go and use the central Arctic Ocean. But we don't want it to be like a crazy free-for-all where everyone's competing and there's no rules at all. So what we do in the ocean is create regional and sectoral organizations. Regional meaning it covers just a particular area. Sectoral meaning it covers a particular industry. So we have these for ships. That's the International Maritime Organization, or the IMO. I'll talk about all of these again. Fish, those are regional fisheries management organizations. Minerals, that's going to be the International Seabed Authority. And whales, the International Whaling Commission. So I'll say these all again, but we already have kind of an approach of using these types of organizations to manage shared ocean spaces. In the Arctic, the Central Arctic Ocean, right now we don't have one for fish. There's no regional fisheries management organization. What we do have is 16 states got together and they agreed on a moratorium, meaning a temporary pause. Pretty sure it's a 15-year pause on commercial fishing. So no fishing there yet. We're going to not do it for at least 15 years. And during that 15 years, what we're going to do is exploratory scientific fishing. We're just going to figure out what fish are there, so then we can write the rules based on that. This commercial fishing moratorium is a really positive thing because it's a true example, or it's a good, relatively good example of a precautionary approach to the environment, where instead of just like, let's fish, 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 and then figure out the rules, it's, hey, let's pause, let's be cautious, let's do our research on not only the fish, but the larger ecosystems. Then, if we want to do commercial fishing, let's make the rules later. So you call that a precautionary approach and an ecosystem-based approach, where you're not just considering the fish you want to fish, but the whole ecosystem. So this is like a progressive, modern, like pro-international law, pro-cooperation thing. However, what happens next will depend a lot on what this exploratory scientific fishing finds. A lot of fishery scientists don't expect to find a lot of commercially valuable stocks in the Arctic, but there is still a lot of hype and excitement about it, so maybe. It's not guaranteed that at the end of that process, we will build a new multilateral regional fisheries management organization. And by the way, this top left map, that's an example of existing RFMOs that deal with tuna. There's not one in the Arctic yet, but they usually cover big areas. And one of the points of tension in this whole process is that I told you there were 16 members of that commercial fishing moratorium. Well, there's only 5 Arctic coastal states. So those other members include distant water fishing nations. Sorry for the acronyms. You know, I like to be concise. But China has the biggest distant water fleet in the world. Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan kind of round out the top 4. And so shared fisheries exploration, shared fisheries management, it is a recognition of external actors coming into the Arctic and kind of having a right to shape the management of resource extraction. And right now there's a lot of tension between those distant water fishers and coastal states who are trying to like protect their waters from being overexploited. Another possible tension concerns fish on the bottom of the ocean. That's what benthic means. They're sea floor fish. As we'll see, in some parts of the Arctic Ocean, if it's a seafloor fish, the coastal state gets to claim it, as opposed to it being a shared high seas area. So depending on this kind of species you're talking about, it could be a conflict over, is this a Canadian fish? Or is this part of that high seas commercial fishing moratorium system where maybe we'll make rules together? Very exciting stuff. Shipping and whaling. This is all I got here because I needed to be thorough and make sure that you know who can and who is making international rules for uses of the Arctic. The IMO makes rules for ships and shipping. And I'm going to skip to this point at the bottom because I actually didn't say this yet. In the exclusive economic zone, out to 200 nautical miles from the coast, thinking about the water, the coastal state, so like Canada, off of its Arctic coastline, they get to control all the fish. They have sovereign rights over fish. They also get to control scientific research. I hope you're writing this down. I should have said this earlier. This is a key list. In the EEZ, the coastal state controls the fish, has to give permission for scientific research, and controls structures. So like wind turbines or oil and gas rigs, or I don't know, like server farms. Anything you build in the EEZ, the coastal state has control, they have to give permission. So the EEZ is very much about the coastal state asserting control over ocean space. These are the kinds of things that the US can control in its exclusive economic zone. But free navigation through the exclusive economic zone. You have to let other ships pass through your EEZ. That's why we have the International Maritime Organization. If you want to make rules for ships in the exclusive economic zone, they have to be made through the 176 member organization of the IMO. The reason is that ships and shipping, it doesn't really work if there's different rules in every little coastal zone. Like an oil tanker might go through 20 different EEZs on its route. So it wouldn't work for capitalism and for free trade if you didn't have one set of rules. So the IMO has a bunch of rules for ships and shipping, and they've made a special set of rules called the Polar Code for the Arctic and Antarctic. The Polar Code is just amendments to existing agreements they have. So SOLAS is about safety of life at sea. So it's like protection of seafarers and crew and, from weather events, whatever. MARPOL is about marine pollution coming from ships. So basically, you have these existing big treaty agreements, and the IMO just added specific rules for the Arctic that are like a little bit of a higher standard. The IMO is considering banning heavy fuel oil, which is especially environmentally damaging for the Arctic. Hasn't done that yet. The
Dr.
IMO could also designate parts of the Arctic as particularly sensitive sea areas where there's extra special rules for that area. That's a state-led process. So like, I think this could be a plan, perhaps. I don't know. You can decide whether it's a plan or counterplan, topicality-wise. But the United States or any Arctic state could submit an area to be a particularly sensitive sea area to the IMO. And then the IMO could say yes or no to that.
Dr. Mendenhall,
Please.
we have a question. Bella, would you come up here?
Sorry, it's a quick clarifying question.
Good.
When you were talking about the EUZ with the fishing research and structure zones,
Mhm.
I was wondering what map would show us what those regions are. I was confused on which one was which. Like,
Okay, yeah.
which countries have control over which zone?
Oh, yeah. Let's go back here. So it's the color coded here on this map. So the Alaskan EEZ is that kind of coral color. The Russian EEZ is this teal color. There are lots of these maps available. Like I would just search Arctic EEZ map to find these when I was preparing. And we're going to see other maps of this too, but the basic abstract map is this one. And there are some differences in the territorial sea. You can totally ignore this contiguous zone. But the 200-mile, that's what I have limited time, so that's why I'm focusing on the 200-mile zone because it's the biggest coastal state claim. And also in terms of exploration and development, the EEZ is the most relevant because the coastal state controls scientific exploration and resource development in this region.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Sure. Yeah, and we'll see other maps too, so more clarification opportunity. Okay, for whaling. Oh, was there another one?
Yeah, I have to switch the display for just a second.
Okay.
So, give me just a moment. Here we go.
We're good to go? Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay, give us a shout out.
Hi.
We're good.
Okay, great. Whaling, I don't expect commercial whaling to extend into the Arctic. There's not pelagic whaling, meaning far away from the coast. So littoral is coastal, pelagic is middle of the ocean. Those are science words. However, the International Whaling Commission does authorize Aboriginal subsistence whaling, that's their term, for communities in Alaska and also in Greenland. So there is some whaling that happens, and it's really quite interesting how they make decisions about it. It's kind of a combination of cultural traditional rights and environmental sustainability assessment. So I don't think this is going to be a big area for cases, but whaling does happen. It is coastal. It is tied to indigenous groups. And I don't foresee much change in that. Okay, so we talked a bit about, what's in the EEZ. The coastal state can control the fish, the structures, and the science, but they can't control the navigation. In the high seas, like the Central Arctic Ocean or that banana hole or that loophole, that governance happens through regional or sectoral organizations. The International Maritime Organization, they deal with the shipping. We might have a fisheries organization that deals with the fishing. The International Whaling Commission, they deal with the whaling. But now we're going to talk about the sea floor. So you're looking at the yellow part of this image. The two relevant zones are the continental shelf and what's beyond it. This image says the deep seabed. The term is actually the area with a capital A. Very boring, but you're going to see it in your reading, area with a capital A. So this is way less clear than what's happening with the water column. And so we're talking about this Arctic Ocean basin, the sea floor. So you're kind of going to get this in bits and pieces. And the first bit you're getting is for the deep seabed, the international seabed, the area. So beyond national jurisdiction, it doesn't belong to any one state. That is governed by the International Seabed Authority, the ISA. Very in the news right now. Could have been a whole debate topic of their own. The ISA is an intergovernmental organization. It's all the member states of the Law of the Sea Convention. And they make all the rules for seabed mining in the area. And they do it based on the rules that were written in the 70s and 80s on seafloor exploration or seafloor exploitation. They govern the area as the common heritage of the treaties used to say mankind, recently updated to humankind. This means that if you do seabed mining in the area, you have to go through the ISA, get their permission, and eventually you got to share some money from what you earned. The US has rejected this system completely. They say it's international taxation. That's why we haven't ratified the Law of the Sea. We don't participate in the International Seabed Authority. So far, there's no activity in the Arctic seafloor that is the area. You can see on this map on the bottom left, the zones where the International Seabed Authority is governing mining. They're elsewhere. They're mostly in the Pacific. But the ISA is at a critical moment, like today, in that they have all this urgency that I can talk about later, you can research later, to finish the rules now so that mining won't go ahead without the rules. But the US is rejecting the system and trying to go at it unilaterally on its own. And there's this big movement, maybe we shouldn't do seabed mining at all. So the topic of seabed mining gets into these larger questions about multilateral governance versus US going on its own, or about global environmental protection versus profit motive, or profit motive versus equitable benefit sharing, like a pro-economic justice argument. And the reason it matters in the Arctic, even though this isn't happening yet in the Arctic, is that the Arctic seafloor map looks more like this. As you'll see, Arctic coastal countries, they're claiming all the Arctic seafloor as belonging to them. But if it doesn't, then it belongs to the International Seabed Authority and we all share the benefits. So, as I hope to talk my way into, any Arctic case or counterplan that deals with the Arctic sea floor is going to be making an impact on this larger question of who gets the Arctic sea floor. Are we going to share it equitably? Are we going to encourage mining, etc.? So I hope to get through the details so that you can understand why seafloor activity is especially interesting on this topic. This is my biggest part of the PowerPoint. I may need to not say anything about Alaska, but hopefully those slides will be explanatory. This is all Law of the Sea stuff, but most of your Arctic cases are going to touch on the ocean in some way. And they're all, any kind of authorizing of activity generally makes a point about which side you agree with in these disputes. So there's three kinds of disputes. That's why these three different sets of color. So in the Beaufort Sea, which is between the US and Canada, you'll see more maps. And in the Bering Sea, between the US and Russia, the disagreement is where the EEZs end. So they both claim 200 nautical miles. Like, what about the overlap? What about when there's a border? So that's not fully resolved yet. The Northwest Passage and Northern Sea Route, that question is who can send ships through there? So the same type of, is it an international strait or are they fully domestic waters? The last one, the Lomonosov Ridge, that's about the sea floor. So we've got competing exclusive economic zone claims. We've got competing claims about what is an international strait, and we've got competing claims over the seafloor. And I'm going to walk you through these. But very quick on the Bering Sea and Beaufort Sea, because honestly, for me, they're the boring ones. But given the Trump administration and recent changes in US-Canada and US-Russian relations, they could become very interesting. So in the Bering Sea, we came up with a deal in the 90s. There's a lot of uncertainty about how the deal was reached. The US Senate ratified the agreement for the final line, but the Russian Duma did not. And so that's why it's unresolved. In practice, they've been treating it as the border, but you can find some authors who say Russia is going to bring this up at a key moment. It's possible that some kind of Bering Sea case could help resolve this or trigger it. For the Beaufort Sea, this is an adjacency question. So Canada and Alaska are next to each other. How do you draw the line up the middle? Canada says, let's use the old line that Russia and Great Britain negotiated back when the land belonged to them. The US says, no, 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 that's old. We're the US and Canada now. We should draw a new line based on the Law of the Sea Convention rules. That's what UNCLOS is. And the Law of the Sea Convention says, like, do the halfway point, but make it equitable. Really unclear what that is. This hasn't been a big deal because the US and Canada have had really good relations, but there is shared oil deposits there. So this could certainly be an issue that triggers a decline in US-Canada relations. All right, now I'm getting to more interesting territorial disputes, and you are going to have to know, this is United Nations Law Convention on the Law of the Sea. You're going to have to know what these concepts mean to understand this debate. But I'm going to introduce them in the context of these scenarios. So baseline, international strait, extending your continental shelf, and Article 234. I don't have a better name for that. But let's just start here with the baseline, the top right. You can see that the baseline, that's just the starting point from which you claim an exclusive economic zone and a continental shelf. So you got to figure out where your starting point is. Article 234 is Article 234 of the Law of the Sea Convention, which I've asked Dan to send you my full copy of the Law of the Sea Convention so you can see this. Russia and Canada negotiated for this rule. Basically, what it says is that in ice-covered areas, the coastal state, so like the US, Russia, Canada, whatever, they can make extra rules for navigation in their exclusive economic zone if it's about reducing pollution. Because pollution in ice-covered areas is like really, really damaging. And Russia and Canada use this to justify stronger rules for navigation through their Arctic Ocean exclusive economic zones. No clue what ice-covered means. You can find articles that say covered in ice half the year, covered in ice during the 70s, only when it's covered in ice. So that is definitely something that if a team takes a position on, they may be taking the Russian position or the US position or a position that is nonsensical relative to the law of the sea. But so there are disputes over, can Russia and Canada make these extra rules? Like how far can they go restricting navigation for marine pollution issues? All right, I'm struggling without your energetic feedback, but I'm assuming you're really into it and you're following. So if you're not, no, everything okay, looks good. I hope you're with me. Okay, baselines. This is the starting point. There's two kinds, normal versus straight. Bottom left, that's a screenshot of the Alaskan baseline. We use normal baselines there. It's just along the coast. And then that first line is 12 miles. The second line is 24 miles. Other Arctic states, like Norway, Russia, and Canada, they use straight baselines, which means they go point to point along their outer fringe of islands. Anything on the inside of the baseline, that's full sovereign territory. They call it internal waters. You can make any rules you want for internal waters. And so they have really big claims of internal waters in the Arctic because of these straight baselines. I promise it will become sexy and interesting later, straight baselines. So now we're talking about the Northwest Passage. It is multiple routes through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The question is this internal waters that Canada can 100% control however they want, or is this an international strait that they have to allow ships through? Canada claims strait baselines around their entire Canadian Arctic archipelago. That means the Northwest Passage is 100% full Canadian territory. They can exclude anyone they want. The US and sometimes the EU comes in on behalf of this side as well, but it's primarily the US. The US says, no, it's an international strait. We can go through it anytime we want. We don't have to follow your rules. We don't need your permission. The category international strait, that also comes from the Law of the Sea Convention. So the US says, well, it connects EEZ or high seas on both sides. So that's an international strait. And there's a history of us using it internationally, and you acquiesced. You didn't say anything about it. So it's an international strait. Now, my images on the bottom, the Bering Strait and the Nares Strait, those are definitely, everyone agrees they're international straits in the Arctic, so that you have to allow any state to pass through. But this one, it's really the US and sometimes the EU says this is an international strait. And the stakes are who gets to decide the rules there. So Canada says, hey, we use strait baselines. It fits all the justifications the International Court of Justice said. I'm kind of behind, so I'm trying to speed up a little bit here. So I'm not going to say everything on the slide. They also say Article 234, like even if it wasn't, we can have this separate legislation, have extra control for pollution reasons. So they have like a multi-layered argument. The US argument is based very much on something that happened in 1969. The US sent through a boat, did not ask permission. The Canadian Coast Guard said, we're giving you permission and we're going to give you an escort. And so it's one event that the US says it was international passage, you acquiesced, and Canada said, no, we were friends and we gave you permission. We've always controlled this strait. So this historical interpretation kind of determines the strength of the argument that this is an international strait, because there's not a lot of other examples of foreign ships passing through the Northwest Passage. So if your app does anything that sends traffic through the Northwest Passage, it's going to trigger this dispute. Since the 80s, it's been pretty chill though. There haven't been disputes about it. I think that one of the reasons it might matter, especially to the US, is that in an international strait, submarines can stay submerged. They are in their normal mode of passage. And if anyone wants to send submarines in there, if it's internal waters, Canada can say no submarines, or you have to be on the surface. If it's an international strait, everyone can sneak their submarines through there. And of course, if it's internal waters, Canada can do more to prevent environmental issues or security issues. If it's an international strait, they're really limited in how much they can manage the navigation. Same issue with the Northern Sea Route, except for look at this. It's just some strait baselines around the outer edge of Russia's islands. So it's not the whole thing. So parts of the Northern Sea Route go through claimed internal waters. It's the same kind of debate. Russia says these strait baselines are fine. It's the normal direction of the coast. The US says, no, it's an international strait. But this argument that the Northern Sea Route is an international strait, only the US makes it. And it is weaker than the other claim because in the 60s, when the US tried to send a boat through there, Russia threatened so much that they turned around. And so there's a history, in fact, of the US turning around and not going through when Russia refused. Russia also argues, listen, you want these to be internal waters because we're going to provide support, we're going to provide search and rescue, we're going to provide weather monitoring. But on the other hand, we're going to charge you transit fees. We're going to charge you and make you have extra insurance. So the control by the coastal state could be a good thing for facilitating trade and reducing security impacts. You're going to want to know FONOPS, the Freedom of Navigation Program or Freedom of Navigation Patrols. FONOPS is FONOPS. This program has existed since 1979, and it's also really relevant to the South China Sea. It's when the US sends ships through to prove a point about what the international law is. And so that 1969 transit, even though that wasn't a military vessel, that was a kind of freedom of navigation patrol to prove this is an international strait. We haven't done them in the Arctic yet, but it's being considered. And if we purposely try to send a boat through here without permission, that will be very controversial and could be an escalatory scenario. Okay, I got 10 minutes left. I got to get through the Lomonosov Ridge. I remember Lomonosov because LMNO, they go in that order, Lomonosov. Named after a Russian explorer. The Lomonosov Ridge is claimed by Denmark through Greenland, Russia, and Canada. It's kind of hard to see on this map, but all three of them claim up that middle Lomonosov Ridge. Why do they want it? Minerals. So these are images. On the left is the US extended continental shelf, which I'll talk about in a bit, and the Norwegian extended continental shelf. On both of those claims by the US and Norway, they're seeing, hey, there's minerals here, we want to mine. So it's very likely that there's also minerals in the Lomonosov Ridge. So when you hear people say, oh, Russia claimed the North Pole, that's what they mean. They claim the Lomonosov Ridge is an extension of their continental shelf. Now, this is the key element you're missing to understand what's going on here. So you know that every coastal state gets 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone that allows them to control the fish, the science, and the structures. That's just the water, the sea surface and the water column. On the sea floor, every state gets 200 nautical miles of continental shelf, but they can extend it if their physical shelf goes beyond that. And that's what Russia, Denmark, and Canada are claiming, that Lomonosov Ridge is an extension of their continental shelf. So it depends on geology, what kind of rocks are down there, and geomorphology, what the shape of the seafloor is. This is all in Article 76 of the Law of the Sea Convention. But if it's an oceanic ridge, nobody can claim it as an extension of their shelf. Oceanic ridge is undefined, very unclear what it means. States want to make big continental shelf claims because on the continental shelf, they get sovereign rights over resources. Non-living resources like oil, gas, and minerals, and those benthic fish, sedentary living species. Sedentary also not defined. If you want to extend your continental shelf, the law of the sea process is you take the rules from Article 76, you collect a bunch of data, and you submit your claim to the CLCS. That's the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. It's a group of scientists. They have a huge backlog. Originally, we thought 30 states were going to make claims. It's over 90 now. It takes decades for them to recommend whether or not you can extend your continental shelf. The top map here, these are unresolved extended continental shelf claims around the world. The US has not ratified the Law of the Sea Convention and arguably cannot get this recommendation from this group of scientists. The group of scientists are also not supposed to deal with disputed areas. They're not supposed to intervene when claims overlap. So our current status, and if you look up CLCS claims, you can see a big table of every state that's claimed. Denmark, Canada, and Russia have all claimed the Lomonosov Ridge, and they have all asked the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf to give their opinion about the geomorphology, and later they'll figure out who gets what part. It's possible the CLCS will say, no, that is an oceanic ridge, nobody gets it. In that case, that whole Central Arctic sea floor, that would be governed by the International Seabed Authority. And it would be the common heritage of all humans, and we all get to share from it. The CLCS could make this decision at any time. They've been working on it for years. And it seems most likely that if they do say this is some continental shelf, that the three states will work it out among themselves. Sorry, question?
Yep.
My name's Dylan. My question was, do you know if any of these three states made the claim like definitely first before the other?
Yes, Russia, but they were given a revise and resubmit from the CLCS. You got to collect more data. Go to the CLCS. If you just type in CLCS claims, you'll see a big table and you can see the order that they were all made in.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It doesn't matter from the law of the sea perspective, though. Yeah, it's not a first come, first served situation. Okay, the really exciting part for this topic is in December 2023, the US just made an extended continental shelf claim. And I'm just zooming in on the Arctic area. It goes out more than 600 nautical miles into the Arctic seafloor, and check it out, it's the same spot all this oil and gas is. If the AF does anything beyond 200 nautical miles on the continental shelf, that's going to be hugely controversial. The US did follow the Article 76 rules, and they have a report explaining how they followed all those rules. But they didn't submit to the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. I really like this 2017 article that concludes that the US could submit, but the CLCS could say, we don't have to look at this, we're not going to look at this. But the US didn't even try. And so Russia and China immediately rejected this claim and said, you skipped the line. There's no guarantee you follow the rules. And also the rest of us have to wait more than a decade for our rulings. So anything you do in this area, which I think is likely for AFs because of all the oil and gas and minerals, is going to trigger a big reaction from Russia and China. Arguably, it threatens the whole credibility of the law of the sea for the US to move forward on extraction in this area. If you're talking about ground fish, sedentary species, or like crabs, and the US is authorizing fishing there, that is really controversial. First of all, are they high seas fish or are they shellfish? And secondly, are those your fish or not? Also, I think as a solvency issue for cases, though, private companies don't want to invest when there's legal uncertainty, especially for mining and drilling, which are like high capital, big infrastructure projects. And they would fear that they wouldn't be able to sell their outputs on global markets. Article 82 is an interesting wrinkle. If you do any kind of mining or drilling out there, the Law of the Sea Convention requires that on the extended continental shelf, you have to share some of the benefits. So it's a little bit like the area, it's money sharing. So if you are into this, look up Article 82, you could see. If the AF doesn't meet the rules of Article 82, that also triggers all of these negative impacts even more. Very interesting. I think that I'm going to move on for time reasons, but all of this US unilateral seafloor extraction on the continental shelf is tied to the US unilaterally under Trump trying to authorize seafloor mining in the Pacific, because it's all the same kind of engagement to the Law of the Sea Convention and had the same kind of impacts to multilateralism. Oh, 2 minutes. Okay. You're going to read these slides later. The points I was going to make are the US doesn't know anything about Alaska. Twice as many people visit Alaska via cruises every year as are populated in Alaska. The Alaskan population is 0.2% of the US population. The federal government owns a ton of land in Alaska, including on the northern slope, which gives the AF a fair amount of control over Alaskan land. Different kinds of land they own. There's only 3 native Alaskan groups who primarily live above the Arctic Circle, so there's definitely interesting debates to be had about who is an Arctic population or what is an Arctic area. The Arctic native communities generally do have a stronger political situation relative to the federal government than other Native American communities, but of course a really long history of exploitation, especially from a cultural and social perspective, kind of inequality and various forms of suppression. The indigenous communities are especially susceptible to issues with climate change, and so an AF might potentially relocate or provide funding for relocation for coastal indigenous communities. This has already happened just a little bit because of sea level rise, but the permafrost melt is a big issue here. Alaska is generally quite Republican. There is an Arctic caucus that includes Maine as well. Very interesting for politics debates because the senator from Maine, oh, I'm blanking on her name. It's Murkowski. And who's the other one? Anyway, the Alaskan senator and the Maine senator, they're swing vote senators. And so on Arctic issues, Alaskan issues, they could definitely exercise leverage on other pieces of legislation. The US has a really all over the place Arctic strategy militarily. All the different service branches have their own Arctic strategy. It doesn't always line up. And our resources are really threatened by permafrost melts. You know, we don't have enough icebreakers. And yet we claim things like a gigantic air identification zone, air defense identification zone, where if you're in this area, you got to tell us that you're here so that we have some kind of control and management. So a real asymmetry. Alaska is huge, has tons of resources, gives the federal government a lot of control, and yet is not very influential in American politics, except for these two senators. Alaskan military and strategic resources really don't fit the overall goals and claims that we're making. I am going to send you a list of recommended citations that came from my citation reference software, Zotero. I think these are two really good places to start, these articles. And these are all the authors that I read on Arctic issues. Rebecca Lorna Johnstone, oh, it's Rachel Lorna Johnstone. She's especially good on Arctic indigenous issues. I think, you know, I'm a law of the sea person, so for me, a big question is, are you going to follow the rules or not? And who are you going to work with in terms of joint development and kind of norm creation? So these are my thoughts. I am out of time, so I could explain them if you want, but maybe there's questions.
Okay, before we get to questions, let's give a great round of applause for Dr. Mendenhall. I just gotta stop the recording real quick. If you have a question, come line up over here. It could be